Hi everyone, my name is Becca and welcome to my presentation today, Mindful Feedback, How Product Teams Can Grow. So I'm really excited to be doing this talk with Product School. I think it's a topic that we don't really talk about much in the product community, and I hope it's going to be really helpful today. So a quick overview of what we'll cover. So the first thing I'd like to do is talk about the importance of continuous feedback for product teams. Then I'll talk about how to adopt a more mindful approach to feedback and why that's important. And then I'll move on to talk about how we as product managers can manage negative feedback that can happen in our day-to-day work. So firstly, a little bit about me. So I'm a product manager at an early stage fitness startup in London. I've worked in startups throughout my whole career and I love them. As an individual, I've always encouraged people to give me continuous feedback. So whether that be positive or negative feedback, I think it's really important for self-improvement and growth. And, now I've realized how important it can be for product teams. And so I'm really passionate about helping other product managers and other product people leverage that to really empower and grow their product teams today. So what is feedback? So by definition, feedback is the return of information that is provided following an activity or process. And I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into the meaning of feedback. What is and what isn't feedback? So feedback can be positive or negative. Sometimes people call this constructive feedback. So, positive can be in the form of praise or congratulations if something or a project has gone really well. Or it can sometimes be more negative or constructive, where you look at challenges that a team has faced or things which may not have gone to plan, and you look for areas where you can improve. Something to remember is that opinions are not feedback. And something that I always try to get people to remember is that when you're giving feedback, it should always be productive and helpful to the person that's on the receiving end. It's also important to remember that feedback isn't just given in meetings and verbally. So, today we're in a remote world and it's really hard to read people's body language, but often it can be indirect feedback that you get in meetings. So, body language, like I just said, or tone of voice. And so it's important to remember that feedback is going on all the time, even if you don't actually notice it. So, why am I doing this talk? Why is feedback important for product managers? So, being a product manager is a really, really collaborative role. So, you work with so many different teams every day. You have your designers, you have your engineers, and you also have stakeholders which you have to work with on certain projects, right? So, one of the really important reasons for encouraging a continuous feedback culture is because as a product manager, you have to make sure that these teams are all working harmoniously together. Another reason why it's important for product managers is because we work on really diverse projects. And some of these projects are more complex and more challenging than other ones. And when we reflect on these projects, we realize that we have come away with loads of learnings, and that actually empowers the team to grow. They become more experienced, they can do more in the future. Another reason why it's really important for product managers is it's really important for us to know how to motivate our team. And feedback allows us to continue to ensure that we're improving, and it also empowers the team to do better, to grow as a collective. So to put it into perspective, I'm going to tell you a story about what happened to me kind of in the early stages of my product career, where I didn't really value the continuous feedback as a junior product manager. So I was in the beginning of my role, and I was put on quite a big project, and I was working with a squad closely for the very first time. And I was quite out of my depth and I didn't know my team that well. And as the project progressed, was a lot of tension that was growing because there were things that I didn't understand. I was having challenges. I didn't feel like I could ask. And eventually the tension grew to a point where I had to confront it with a couple of the members on my team. And I realized that they had felt the frustrations and they had felt like they couldn't be honest with me about certain things that they felt I wasn't doing that well. And likewise, I hadn't been able to share my true feelings as well. So, what I'm trying to say is when we don't encourage a culture of continuous feedback within our product teams, it can happen that when there are challenges with projects or people behave in certain ways and people don't address it quickly enough, tension can build within the team. And this can often fester and grow into something much bigger than it actually is. And when this does happen, it can lead to demotivation. Team members feel quite unproductive because they can feel this tension in the air. And unfortunately, people become quite focused on the problems rather than looking to solutions. They can become quite bogged down by it. And that really discourages communication. So you can imagine when there's tension, when you feel demotivated, when you think that there are only problems in front of you, you feel like you can't really express what those are and openly communicate with your team. But actually, if we as product managers can create a culture of feedback within our teams, this sort of thing can actually get addressed much sooner. So issues are exposed earlier because they're surfaced much quicker. And as soon as something is surfaced, you can begin working together towards a solution. So solutions become the top priority. And this actually creates trust within the different team members, okay? And when there's trust and people feel safe, like they can give feedback on a continuous basis and not be judged by it or no one be offended by it, then they actually are much happier, they're more engaged, and this helps them to be more productive in their teams. And this is really great because at the end of the day, your product team can then work together towards delivering much higher quality outcomes. So, how can we adopt a mindful approach to feedback? So, I guess the important thing to address here is what do I mean by being mindful when we give feedback? So, when I talk about mindfulness when you're giving feedback, it's about having an awareness of the individual and the individuals that make up your team. So, you should be thinking about, how can I construct this feedback in such a way that it's going to be useful and it's going to be productive for the person that's receiving it. And this can be said for positive or negative feedback, but particularly when you're thinking about negative feedback, one interesting stat is 92% of respondents agreed that negative feedback, if delivered appropriately, is effective at improving performance. So that's the really interesting part, if delivered appropriately. So, how can you figure out how to deliver negative feedback appropriately to people on your product team? So there's a really great book by Kim Scott called Radical Candor. And in this book, she talks about how to be able to challenge someone directly, that person who you're challenging, they need to know that you care personally and humanly about them. So that part's really interesting. How do we, as product managers, ensure that people on our product team know that when we're giving them feedback, that we do care personally and humanly about them and we do it with good intentions? So there are a couple of things to have in mind if this is what you want to do. The first thing is to really think about the individual and the individuals that make up your team. So what kind of person are they? Are they confident? Are they outgoing? Are they an introvert? This will influence how they will receive and give feedback to people on their product team. What values do they hold? What's important to them? What makes them feel proud of their work? When you think about all these answers to these questions, to the people that you're potentially giving feedback to, this really influences how you approach what you say. Another thing to think about is what is their role in the business or the team? An engineering manager has a very different role to a marketing director. So it's really important when you're thinking about giving feedback what their role is in the team, but also in the wider business. Also, be mindful as well of any cultural differences. So, like we said before, product managers work with loads of different teams, and it could be that someone is from a different background or from a different culture, and this can influence sometimes how they give feedback and how they receive it. So, it's good to be mindful of that as well. There are other things as well that you can think about. So, when you're thinking about encouraging a continuous feedback culture in your product teams, it's important to remember to be empathetic. So, let's say there has been a project which hasn't gone very well, and people in the team are feeling quite upset about it. It's important for everyone to be mindful of any internal or external pressures that people in the team have been faced with. So, for example, if you've worked really closely with a stakeholder from the sales team, just be mindful that maybe they were under a lot of pressure to deliver certain targets, and that could have influenced maybe a certain thing that they said or any behavior or any action. And it's not to say that it was okay or to be forgiving, but it's just to create that context. Remember to ask yourself, how would you feel if someone came to you with this feedback? So, again, when you're thinking about how to phrase your feedback, whether that be positive or negative, just remember to really put yourself in the other person's shoes and think about how it's going to sound to them. Recognize any biases. So, particularly if you've worked with the same teams before and it can be particularly challenging, try as much as you can to recognize that you might be holding onto some historical event that's happened or any bias that could be influencing how you approach this feedback that you're going to give them. The other thing I think is important to remember when you're building a culture of feedback within your product teams is to remind everyone to try and assume good intent all the time. So make sure you encourage people to think about listening to both sides of the story. So to see it from, the stakeholder's point of view and also the engineering manager's point of view. Also, remember to ask yourself, how well do you know the individual or the team? So this goes back to knowing as much as you can about the individuals that make up the team and what would be typical behavior for them, what's expected from them. And this will help you to understand if you are actually assuming good intent by what's happened. And try not to judge. It's always hard to do that when people are coming to you and explaining the way certain things have gone in a project, especially if it's been quite challenging and they're letting off steam. But it's really important for you to focus on how can you help improve this next time. Another really important thing to set your team up for success when it comes to feedback is thinking about the format. So often, if tensions have risen and a certain project has been really challenging, people can quite quickly, jump to a conversation and say, hey, this was really bad. I didn't like how you did this. But actually, one way to format that conversation is just be really open and just say, hey, I know that this didn't really go that smoothly. Is there anything I can do to help improve this next time? And what that does is it makes you and the other person a part of the same solution. So you're working together towards making improvements for next time, and you're removing any element of blame. So you can just focus on the solution and the improvement. Another way that you can approach someone who you might need to address something with is to say something like, hey, when you said this the other day, it made me feel like this. And what that does is it just gives the other person an opportunity to explain, and they're no longer defensive. They're open to hearing how that made you feel, but also working with you so that you can get clarification on what it was that they actually meant to say or how you can improve things next time. The other thing to think about, especially now, we're all working remotely. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it's harder to read people's body language and to understand what underlying things might be happening. So just think about how should you be giving this particular feedback to someone? Is it direct messages? Can that sometimes get a little bit lost? Should you jump on a call with someone? Should you do it on a video call? So just be mindful of the methods that you're using to give feedback to people on your team. Another thing I would say is as often as you can, try and go directly to the person that you want to give feedback to. Sometimes it's easier to go through a manager or through a peer, but especially if it's something quite challenging that's happened, often it's much easier to go to the person directly, and they really appreciate this a lot. And one thing to just say at this point is, all of these steps which you can take to really encourage mindful feedback and continuous feedback within your product teams is not to sugarcoat feedback in any way. It's not to make it any less important than what you truly have to say. But what you're doing is you're creating a foundation. You're creating a foundation so that your product team feels safe, so that they trust one another, and so that they know that this feedback is being given on a continuous basis because everyone collectively wants to grow and improve together. So, when you do this, feedback becomes a powerful way to build trust and to keep product teams engaged, productive, and focused on delivering high value as a team. So, how can PMs manage negative feedback? So, I've left this part in the presentation because as product managers, there are two ways we come across negative feedback. Because we work with so many different teams, and sometimes we can work on big and complex projects, we can often be the receivers of negative feedback. So we can be indirectly given negative feedback because maybe people are frustrated with other teams or people rely on you quite heavily. The other thing is that we also have to be facilitators of feedback between different teams that maybe don't work with each other on a regular basis, or maybe ones which do. So it's really important that we as product managers have ways that we can manage negative feedback in our day to day. So the first thing I would say is when you find yourself in this situation, try to focus as much as you can on the problem. So remove the personal element, even though you are the person that connects lots of different teams. It's really important to focus on specific things in the project or the product process, which you can improve next time. And you can really help to make sure that things are better for other people in the long term. So try as best you can to move away from blame and try to move away from saying, oh, I wish I had done this. That's just unproductive. So look ahead. The other thing you can do as a product manager is take control. So you can create regular opportunities for feedback within your product teams. So retrospectives are a really great way to encourage continuous feedback. And you can also have one-to-ones with people who make up your product team. So maybe your design lead, any devs, or an engineering manager. This means that you're creating opportunities where you'll get regular positive and negative feedback. So things are not only brought to the surface sooner, but nothing should really be a surprise to you, and it will help you manage this stream of feedback. Also, set expectations and guides to encourage how people give feedback. So, for example, as you took the time to understand the individuals that make up your product team, make sure that people know how you best want to receive feedback. So, do you want it to be written? Do you want someone to jump on a call with you? So make sure people are aware of how you as a product manager want feedback. And also make sure people are aware again of people's different roles and how that can reflect in their actions sometimes and what pressures they might be under. And hold yourself accountable to any actions and improvements for future projects. And finally, stay positive. So often projects don't go to plan, and it can often feel like you're to blame, but it's really important to stay positive and to be that positive person in the product team. Feedback leads to growth after all, and so focus on the things you'll learn as a team, as a squad, how you'll feel after it, and what you'll achieve. And this will really help you as a product manager to manage that negative feedback. So don't focus too much on the past and look forward. So to summarize, feedback is a powerful tool that encourages and empowers product teams to grow. When we create a continuous feedback culture within our product teams, this builds trust, it improves productivity, and it leads to higher quality outcomes. When you're building that continuous feedback culture, make sure to be mindful and consider the individuals on your team. So go back to those questions at the beginning of the presentation and ask yourself if you can answer all those questions about the people on your team, because that will influence the way that you teach your team how to communicate feedback with each other, both positive and negative. And as a PM, take control of feedback and make it an integral part of your team. So have regular retrospectives and create this culture where feedback is openly received and continuously received, because everyone collectively understands that you're all growing together and you're aiming higher together. So if you found this talk on feedback useful, I've attached some other useful resources on the topic. I think these are really, really helpful resources, so I'd encourage anyone who enjoyed this topic to take a look. And I hope you enjoyed this talk from me. So I'm Becca Vibert, and I'm talking regularly for the product school at the moment, but you can also find me on LinkedIn, on Medium, and I'm happy for you to get in touch and let me know your feedback. And thank you very much.